Imagine the majestic Rome in 204 AD. The city, like a living organism, pulsed with the voices of thousands of its inhabitants, yet in the shadowy backstreets of the Subura district, a sinister event was brewing, one capable of shaking the very foundations of the empire. A mere youth, barely 16 years old, whose blood was inextricably linked to the imperial dynasty, was destined to become the victim of a treacherous betrayal by those he implicitly trusted, his own twin brother. A night that promised to be festive and carefree would turn into a humiliating and morally degrading nightmare for the heir to the Roman throne, surpassing his darkest premonitions. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but in the annals of history, he would be known as Caracalla, an emperor who, having survived unimaginable betrayal, would return to power to become one of the most ruthless and formidable rulers the world had ever seen. The reader will witness how a brother, blinded by insatiable ambition, transformed the legitimate heir of the empire into a powerless slave, and how this tragic experience would serve as the starting point for an era of terror that forever altered the course of Roman history. To grasp the full depth of this drama, one must transport oneself to the very heart of the Roman Empire, to 204 AD. Rome at that time was experiencing a period of flourishing growth and territorial expansion under the astute guidance of Emperor Septimius Severus, a man who had successfully consolidated his power after decades of bloody civil wars. His cherished dream was to create a mighty and unshakable dynasty that would ensure a continuous transfer of power within his family, guaranteeing stability and prosperity for the empire for many years to come. Septimius's design appeared flawless. Fate had blessed him with two twin sons, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, born first, and Publius Septimius Geta. Both brothers saw the light of day in Lugdunum, now known as Lyon, France, and from an early age, they were prepared to govern the great empire. However, despite their blood kinship, their characters were markedly different from one another. Marcus, as the elder brother, was impulsive, arrogant, and possessed a strong military spirit. The legions adored him, seeing in him a future commander capable of leading them to new victories. Geta, by contrast, was calculating, skilled in political intrigue, and cold-blooded. And although Roman laws favored Marcus as the firstborn, Geta did not wish to spend his entire life in his brother's shadow, content with a secondary role. In those times, the inheritance of imperial power was not merely a family affair, but a brutal struggle for dominance, involving the Senate, the army, and the Roman nobility. Every gesture of the emperor, every favor he granted, could tip the scales one way or another. In this atmosphere of tension, the rivalry between the brothers escalated into something far more dangerous, a hidden war for the imperial throne. It was in this atmosphere of ambition and mutual distrust that Geta made a decision destined to forever change the course of the empire's history. He plotted to eliminate Marcus without directly staining his hands with murder. His plan was exceptionally sophisticated. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus had turned 16. The imperial palace was preparing for a grand ceremony. The Senate and the legions were to witness his official proclamation as heir to the throne. It seemed that on this day, Marcus's fate was sealed. Yet, in the shadows, Geta was already harboring a plan to ensure this day would never come. Driven by treacherous designs, Geta had no desire to stain his hands with his brother's blood. It was clear to him that the direct elimination of Marcus would inevitably incur his father's wrath and suspicion. Instead, a far more sophisticated plan was maturing in his mind. Geta intended to destroy Marcus as a person, strip him of his honor and dignity, and forever tarnish his name with shame, so that he could never even contemplate ascending the throne. To achieve this vile goal, he turned to Marcus Corbuus, a man whose name struck terror throughout Rome. This sinister slave trader was renowned for his ability to erase identities and transform noble citizens into faceless commodities, devoid of past or future. On the eve of the important ceremony, he had allured his brother to a private celebration held at a secluded villa outside the city. Marcus, naive and trusting, readily accepted the invitation, unaware that this dinner party would be his last meal as a free prince. The wine served at the table had been poisoned with a narcotic potion, secretly brought from distant Egypt. This insidious venom gradually dulled Mark's senses, plunging him into unconsciousness. As Marcus, devoid of strength, collapsed to the floor, heavily armed thugs stormed the villa. In a matter of moments, the prince was chained and secretly transported through an extensive network of underground tunnels to the very heart of the capital's dark and dangerous district, Sabura. There, far from the luxury of palaces and the gleam of marble, lay the filthiest and most degrading slave market in the entire empire. Marcus spent 3 long days unconscious in a dark cell, deprived of light. When he finally regained consciousness, he was no longer the heir to the throne. His hair was dyed, his skin darkened with Eastern pigments, and his body covered with fake symbols to pass him off as a savage barbarian slave captured on the empire's borders. His name was erased from people's memories, his lineage consigned to oblivion. For Rome, Marcus ceased to exist as a prince. He became merely a commodity, stripped of past and future. In the very heart of Sabura, this bustling district of Rome filled with life and vice, a tragic scene unfolded. The heir to the great empire, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus himself, was put up for a shameful auction, like an ordinary slave destined to satisfy base desires. None of those present in that noisy place had any inkling of the youth's true identity. The clamor of merchants and the cries of procurers reached their peak when a young man, with aristocratic features, chained and stripped of his name, was presented before the crowd. For the paltry sum of 300 gold denarii, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, heir to the Roman throne, was sold into slavery. His buyer was Gallus Valerius Maximus, owner of the most luxurious and notorious brothel in Sabura, where behind unassuming doors, the most intimate desires of the powerful were fulfilled. This 3-storied building was not merely a place of debauchery, but a veritable factory of humiliation and the degradation of the human spirit. On the ground floor, clients were offered illustrated catalogs of live merchandise. The second floor was lavishly furnished. Rooms, filled with the aromas of incense and anointed with oils, were intended for the pleasures of the elite. On the third floor, as if in a gilded cage, dwelt the slaves, awaiting their turn to be used. Here, Marcus Aurelius was given a new name, Mark Servius, and a fabricated legend of a barbarian captured in the Germanic lands. For several days, he was kept in solitary confinement, fed only bread and water, until his body and spirit were broken. Soon came his first experience as a sex slave. An influential senator demanded the youth to participate in his hedonistic amusements. What Marcus endured that night was not merely humiliation, but a deep wound inflicted on his sense of self-worth, leaving an indelible mark on his entire life. However, instead of succumbing to despair, Marcus began to develop tactics for psychological resilience. By day, he feigned obedience, playing the role of a compliant slave, fulfilling any demand without a trace of protest. But with the arrival of night, in the solitude of his cell, he returned to his true essence, not Mark Servius, but Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the legitimate heir of the Roman Empire. In this duality of personality, his new strength was born: to observe carefully, remember every detail, and patiently await his moment. Each new client became an open book to him. Marcus meticulously memorized names, faces, intimate secrets entrusted to him in moments of intimacy, as well as weaknesses carefully concealed under a mask of pleasure. Unbeknownst to themselves, the most influential people in Rome were personally cultivating the man who would, in the future, unleash all his power and thirst for vengeance upon them. Among the other slaves, he found an ally, Claudia, an educated Greek woman who taught him to steadfastly endure humiliation while maintaining clarity of mind. It was she who helped him transform pain into a valuable life lesson, and humiliation into a strategic weapon of patience. Within the walls of this establishment, where vice and debauchery reigned, no one could have imagined that instead of destroying the heir to the throne, a future ruler was being forged, one destined to become one of the most formidable emperors in the history of the Roman Empire. January 205 AD marked a turning point in Mark's fate. He had already spent 10 long months in captivity. His body bore the imprint of humiliation and suffering, but his mind remained sharp and perceptive, like a honed blade. And then, like a bolt from the blue, an event occurred that radically changed the course of his life. A high-ranking guest visited the brothel, Marcus Aurelius Cleander, the Praetorian prefect, holding the position of Emperor Septimius Severus's right-hand man. Cleander, seeking solitude and carnal pleasures in this place, was astonished to see the young man named Mark Servus. Despite his dyed hair, artificially altered skin color, and the signs of endured abuse the prefects experienced, I unmistakably recognized in him the features of the emperor's son. This youth was not just one of numerous slaves, but the lost heir of great Rome. Cleander insisted on a private meeting, and alone, Marcus confirmed his true identity, presenting scars known only to members of the imperial family, and revealing secrets of the Senate and the palace that could not be disputed. Cleander realized there was not a moment to lose. The revelation of this secret threatened Rome with an inevitable explosion of scandal that could lead to the complete collapse of the entire empire. On that fateful night, cleverly disguising his true intentions as a routine transaction, Cleander handed Valerius a sum of money that would not arouse undue suspicion. Formally, he was acquiring a new servant for his household, but in reality, he was performing an act of salvation for the heir to the imperial throne. Marcus, like a shadow, was led through a labyrinthine network of secret tunnels, leading directly into the palace. And so, at dawn on a new day, after almost an entire year spent in utter hell, the youth once again beheld the magnificence of marble and gold that had once been the familiar surroundings of his home. The reunion with his father, Septimius Severus himself, was a moment of incredible emotional upheaval. The emperor, who had already mourned his son, believing him irrevocably lost or captured by barbarian tribes, now pressed him to his chest with uncontrollable fury and pain. However, the jubilant joy of his return mingled with unspeakable horror, like a poisonous draught. Marcus recounted in detail all the monstrous specifics of his abduction. He named senators, dishonest merchants, and corrupt military men who had subjected him to humiliation and torture, and he revealed carefully hidden secrets extracted from the mouths of clients. This was truly a horrifying list of corruption and moral decay, capable of destroying the entire imperial government in a single stroke. Septimius Severus instantly realized that his son had returned not merely as a victim, but as a deadly weapon of retribution. The naive and innocent boy he once was had vanished irrevocably, somewhere in the dirty slums of Subura. In his place, a completely different personality had been reborn, cold, calculating, and undoubtedly far more dangerous than could have been imagined. From that fateful moment, father and son began to secretly devise a plan of retribution. Their vengeance would rely not on the steel of blades, but on something far more destructive: the comprehensive power of information and primal fear. After his miraculous return, Marcus disappeared from public view. According to the official version, he was still listed as missing. But in the shadows, together with his father, he began the painstaking work of creating an unprecedented underground network in Rome, woven from threads of blackmail, skillful manipulation, and pervasive terror. Marcus possessed a truly invaluable advantage. He had heard the most intimate secrets and confessions of high-ranking senators, influential merchants, and powerful officers when they believed him to be merely a faceless slave. Secrets of corrupt schemes, dirty political betrayals, illegal dealings, vile conspiracies against the very majesty of the empire, all this compromising information was now in his hands. And Marcus understood perfectly how to turn it into his most formidable weapon. Consistently, one by one, he began to secretly establish contact with his former clients. His message was utterly simple and clear. He knew all their most carefully hidden secrets, all their vile deeds, and confessions made in utter darkness. From now on, they had only two paths: to pledge an oath of unconditional loyalty to the future emperor, or to inevitably face public exposure and a shameful execution for treason. Marcus's influence was felt immediately, as if a magical transformation had touched every corner of Roman society. Senators, once filled with contempt for him, now became his most zealous supporters, ready to defend his interests with unwavering devotion. Military prefects, who once allowed themselves to mock him, now showed unquestioning obedience, becoming his loyal generals, ready to execute any order. Even corrupt merchants, whose hands were stained with dishonest dealings, began to generously finance his ambitious plans, driven by the fear of exposure and inevitable retribution for their crimes. All of Rome, as if hypnotized, unaware of the changes taking place, began to revolve around the figure of the heir, subtly weaving intrigues in the shadows, like a skilled chess player calculating every move. At the same time, Marcus meticulously worked on creating a new public image, designed to conceal the true essence of his transformation. For the general public and members of the Senate, an official version of his long absence was presented, stating that he had been on a secret mission in the eastern provinces, where, disguised, he had infiltrated barbarian tribes, acting as a secret agent of the emperor. This artfully fabricated story, intended to hide the truth, presented his return to Rome as the triumph of a mysterious hero, hardened by harsh trials and ready for new achievements. However, behind this carefully constructed mask lay a far darker and more sinister reality. Marcus was no longer the naive and trusting youth betrayed by Geta. He had transformed into a calculating, patient, and ruthless strategist who had realized that true power lay not in the military strength of legions or the political influence of the Senate, but in possessing intimate secrets capable of destroying lives and reshaping destinies. While the jubilation over his miraculous return echoed throughout the city, Marcus, like a shadow, wove a web of retribution against his brother. The chess game of their lives had reached its climax, and on the board of fate, only one decisive move remained to be made. Rome, 207 AD. 3 long years had passed since that fateful night at the villa, when Geta's betrayal had deeply wounded his brother. Outwardly, it seemed that the twins were reunited, dwelling beneath the arches of the same palace. In public, they exchanged fraternal embraces, shared lavish feasts, and bestowed radiant smiles upon the Senate. Yet, behind every friendly gesture lay an inexorable and burdensome truth. Marcus held in his heart the knowledge of Geta's betrayal, while Geta lived in constant fear that his dark secret would one day be exposed. Marcus, like a seasoned strategist, bided his time for the ideal moment to strike. He did not succumb to the temptation of haste, understanding that patience was the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. And when he felt that all the threads of fate were in his hands, he invited his brother on a hunt in the picturesque Alban forests, a fraternal, secluded journey away from the curious eyes of the palace and undesirable witnesses. Geta, overconfident and carefree, accepted the invitation, unaware that he was repeating Marcus's mistake from many years ago. On the first night, they shared wine and reminisced about the past. But on the second night, Marcus offered his brother a goblet containing the same insidious narcotic that had once been used against himself. The cycle of betrayal and retribution had closed. Geta, unsuspecting, drained the cup, unaware of the impending reckoning. Waking in a dark cave, chained, he realized that the wheel of fortune had come full circle, but this time he was at the epicenter of the storm. Before him appeared the shadows of the past: Corbouz, the cynical human trafficker; Valerius, the brothel owner; and Fabius, one of the procurers who had a hand in the sordid deal. All of them, like cornered animals, were humiliated and powerless. In the torchlight, Marcus emerged, his face a mask of pain and a thirst for vengeance. In his hands, he held irrefutable evidence of Geta's misdeeds: documents, confessions, testimonies of his crimes. Denial was futile. There was no path to salvation. Marcus's verdict was pronounced: cruel, but just. Geta was to drink the same bitter cup as his brother. He awaited the fate of a slave, a new name, humiliating service to those who had once trampled his family. Every suffering, every tear would become a living reproach, a testament to the inevitability of justice. This would not be a swift execution, but a slow, methodical immersion into an abyss of despair, from which there was no return. Geta, like Marcus, was plunged into an abyss of suffering. However, unlike his brother, his spiritual strength proved insufficient for survival. He failed the test, losing his individuality, sense of self-worth, and pride. Once an ambitious and perceptive prince, he transformed into a spineless puppet, devoid of the ability to resist. Marcus achieved his goal, but upon seeing his broken brother, he felt an unexpected emptiness. The victory, undoubtedly, was his, but it could not restore what had been lost. Nevertheless, the narrative did not end there. The demise of Emperor Septimius Severus marked the beginning of a new era, heralded by the official ascension of Caracalla, an emperor whose reign would be characterized by the same relentless cruelty with which he carried out his revenge. In the city of Eboracum, now known as York in Britain, Emperor Septimius Severus passed away. After his death, the Roman Empire came under the rule of his elder son, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known as Caracalla. The long-awaited moment had arrived. The imperial crown finally adorned his brow. However, his ascension to the throne was overshadowed by the tragic shadows of the past. Geta, transformed into a pitiful semblance of a man, was returned to the palace to meet his fate. No trace remained of the ambitious youth who had once harbored plans of betrayal. He had become a shadow, devoid of reason and understanding. Marcus, silent, watched intently as events unfolded. Of the brother who had betrayed him, no trace remained, just as no trace remained of the rival who had challenged him. Before him lay only an empty shell. And in that tragic moment, Caracalla was struck by a bitter realization. His revenge had been too comprehensive. He had, without doubt, eradicated his foe, but in doing so, he had also destroyed the sole reflection of his own self. Geta was secretly put to death. The official authorities in Rome never discovered the true circumstances. Rumors circulated in society about bandit attacks, fatal wounds sustained in battle, and suppressed conspiracies. However, the truth was that the brilliant young man, destined to become emperor, vanished into oblivion, consumed by his brother's merciless justice. Caracalla remained alone at the pinnacle of power, the sole ruler of the empire, yet simultaneously a prisoner of an emptiness that no earthly authority could fill. On the day of his ascension to the throne, as he accepted the imperial regalia, Caracalla felt no jubilation. He had triumphed in the game, crushed his enemy, exacted his revenge, but upon looking into the depths of his soul, he found no trace of the naive boy he once was. In his place, the throne of Rome was crowned by a hardened man, consumed by suspicion and forever scarred by betrayal. The ascent to the summit of power was marked by bloody tragedy, with the lifeless fall of Caracalla's brother, Geta. Thus began the era of one of the most ruthless regimes in the annals of Rome, the reign of Emperor Caracalla, a man who had mastered the art of governance through fear, blood, and universal silence. Caracalla was no longer Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the naive youth who dreamed of the imperial crown. He had transformed into a man whose will was tempered by humiliation, whose heart was poisoned by a thirst for vengeance, and whose mind was riddled with distrust for everyone. His political doctrine was simple and terrifyingly cruel. Any potential threat had to be eliminated before it could manifest itself. Executions began immediately, falling upon senators, military prefects, and merchants. No one could feel safe. A fleeting suspicious glance, a rumor of betrayal, or a careless word was enough to seal one's death warrant. Rome, accustomed to palace intrigues, was shocked by this new level of all-pervading fear. The emperor seemed to know absolutely everything, remembering every face, every secret, every confession obtained within the gloomy confines of Subura. Caracalla's spy network spread across the empire like an invisible swarm. There was no corner where the emperor did not have his informers. Spies infiltrated the Senate, the legions, the markets, and even the homes of noble patricians. Paranoia was elevated to the status of state policy. Punishments were exemplary. A senator who had once dared to insult Marcus Aurelius was forced to publicly admit his guilt in the presence of his colleagues. Military prefects, who had previously despised him, were subjected to sophisticated tortures that mirrored the humiliations Caracalla himself had once endured. Influential merchants were deprived not only of their immense fortunes but also of their family members, executed as a warning to others. All of Rome realized Caracalla knew no forgiveness, and the emperor's justice was as subjective as it was merciless. Caracalla's reign was marked not only by purges of personal enemies. During his 6 years in power, he developed a paranoid system where any suspicion of disloyalty was punishable by death. The number of victims reached an astronomical figure of 50,000 people, significantly exceeding the totals of many of his predecessors. The empire lived in an atmosphere of universal fear, where the emperor's will was law, written in blood. The only person who wielded some influence over Caracalla was his mother, Julia Domna. She possessed the rare courage to speak to him openly, and could sometimes calm his furious rage. However, even she understood that the old Marcus could never return. After the tragedy in Subura, only Caracalla remained, an emperor whose personality had been warped by betrayal, and whose power rested on fear. As is often the case with tyrants whose regimes are founded on fear, Caracalla's end was inevitable. While on a military campaign in Mesopotamia, the emperor, who seemed untouchable, fell victim to the irony of fate. His reign, marked by thousands of executions for the slightest suspicion, concluded in the most unexpected and brutal manner during the most ordinary of moments. One day, as Caracalla led his troops on campaign, he stopped by the road to relieve himself. In that brief moment, deprived of the protection of his personal guard, he became vulnerable. This opportunity was enough for a praetorian named Julius Marcialis, driven by a personal vendetta, to creep up from behind and deliver a fatal dagger blow to the emperor. Marcialis's motive was the execution of his brother by Caracalla's order. The man who had transformed suspicion into his armor met his end exactly as he had always feared: alone, betrayed, and a victim of the very violence he himself had spawned. No legion came to his aid. No ally dared to stand in his defense. All of Rome harbored as much hatred for him as it did fear. In his final moments, according to chroniclers, Caracalla did not recall the glory of his military triumphs or the boundless power he had possessed. His thoughts returned to the 16-year-old youth he once was, naive, trusting, and capable of brotherly love bordering on self-sacrifice. Perhaps for the first time, he realized that his thirst for revenge had transformed him into something worse than his enemies, that by gaining everything, he had lost his humanity. His body was cremated without great honors. the empire continued its existence as if this man had never been. However, the trace of his cruelty remained in the history of Rome, like an unhealing scar in the annals of the West. Thus ingloriously ended the life of Caracalla, the Roman emperor who seemed to command everything, yet could never break the unseen shackles of his tragic past. The biography of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known in history as Caracalla, represents one of the most sinister and bloodthirsty pages in the annals of ancient Rome. A young heir, treacherously deceived by his own family, transformed into a humiliated slave, by a twist of fate ascended the imperial throne to rule, instilling only terror and dread in the hearts of his subjects. But beyond the dry historical facts, this chilling story poses an important question: to what extent can revenge consume a person? Caracalla achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. He not only reclaimed his rightful place on the throne, but also mercilessly destroyed his brother and punished all who had ever dared to humiliate him. Yet, despite this, he never knew true freedom. His tormented soul remained forever captive to the unbearable pain he desperately tried to eradicate. The retribution he so passionately sought ultimately became his own terrible sentence. And perhaps, therein lies the main lesson for future generations. Revenge only promises long-awaited relief, but in reality, it is like a heavy chain that binds us even more tightly to a grim past. In a frenzied attempt to destroy his enemies, Caracalla ultimately destroyed himself. Moral reflections and retribution, the story of Marcus. What are your thoughts? Do you believe Marcus had sufficient grounds for such vengeance? Did his thirst for justice not become a force as ruthless as his brother's deed? This narrative vividly demonstrates the destructive power of betrayal and the bitter fruits of vengeance. Accounts handed down to us from the depths of ancient Rome often compel us to reconsider our perceptions of power, family bonds, and the struggle for survival. In a world where even the strongest blood ties can be severed by insatiable ambition, it is worth remembering: often the most formidable weapon is not an enemy's blade, but that which we ourselves forge within our own souls.